Hey guys, welcome to episode 2 of the European Power Rankings. We now have a date on where stuff's going to start to go down in Europe, and there might be some tournaments coming up as well to certainly keep an eye on. So we are going to try and blast through this as much as possible. There was a bit of a break between episodes because really there wasn't any confirmation of announcements, and some of the teams that were announced potentially to have their rosters locked in did a few changes. And that is going to be one of the focuses of this episode as we take a look at Team Liquid and also the recently announced Vodafone Giants. Joining me is Anderzz and Strong. We are looking to effectively shit talk another Spanish organization on this second episode, so that's always a good look. But who do you want to go for first? Do we want to go for the new Giants or the old Liquid?
I think Liquid would be interesting just to get us started off.
Yeah, so we can set the scene. So Sliggy at the end of First Strike, it was a bit of an embarrassing way to go out of the tournament for them, even though they did lose to Heretics, who won the whole thing. We've already talked about Heretics, and maybe they're not going to be looking as sharp going into the VALORANT Champions tour, but we don't really know how to sort of rate this. So effectively, Sliggy said at the end of that tournament that this team wasn't changing. Then there was the whole rumor of Yugi coming into the team. Sliggy did say that it was only to test how an operator player would play within this team while Solkas was off on his birthday. So I guess the first thing to talk about here then is when you have this old Team Liquid roster, which by the way is Solkas, Eccles, Cryptix, Link, and Scream, would that team have done better if they kept that roster or whether they added in Yugi?
So from my perspective, it's an interesting one, right? Because the problem with Liquid essentially is you're asking two questions there. One, should they have changed the roster in general terms? And two, should they have made essentially that one swap out, right? Which would have been potentially Solkas. I think we heard Eccles also subbed out at one point for Yugi. Make some slots for Yugi. The weird thing about this Liquid roster is you either want to change three to four players or you want to change no players. I don't think this is a roster, just because of how this roster was constructed, just how this roster came up, obviously, starting out as Fish 1, 2, 3 in the beta, with Artist, losing Artist, I didn't scream. I think with the culture of that team, and also with Sliggy, obviously, as coach, for going back to those times, I don't think changing one piece would really work. I feel like it's one of those cases where you're taking such a risk in terms of it gelling that it wouldn't have worked. So I think not swapping out someone for Yugi is probably the right move in terms of making changes in general. I mean, I'll say I'm not a believer in this roster long term. If the option was between making a Yugi change and making no changes, yeah, no changes. If the option was fully change the entire roster, then yeah, probably should have changed the roster.
Team Liquid, if they did change stuff, you run into the scenario that Ninjas in Pajamas have been having throughout 2020, where you kind of go, okay, they're not actually getting to finals, they're not looking that good, but they're looking better than the last time that we saw them. And I think that was TL during First Strike. Could they have won that game against Heretics? Sure. Should they have? Potentially.
Well, so it's kind of tricky because obviously, like, we haven't seen the scrims where Yugi was playing. Anything that we say about him is going to be purely speculative. He could be horrible at this game for all I know. I don't think that's the case.
In the trials, he didn't perform very well, apparently, but go on.
Yeah, so I think that the important thing to keep in mind when you look at TL and start discussing whether or not they should have made changes is you have to expectation set on what their goals are. Yeah. Are they trying to be a 3rd through 10th place team, or are they trying to be the best in the region? I think that if you are trying to be a best in the region, you have to slash and burn a significant segment of that team. I think that if you are okay being a 3rd through 10th place team, then you can probably get away with the people that you currently have. If you want to be consistently 3rd through 5th, then you could probably swap out 1 or 2 pieces and make that slightly more consistent. Specifically to the point, and this is what I sort of teed up beforehand, is if you look at each person within that team and you say, okay, are you a top of region caliber player in your role? You have Scream, who's very clearly top of region in his role. Like, I'm not saying number 1, but there's no argument he's within the top 3 to 5.
Yeah.
Same thing can be said of of Cryptix on Sentinel. Very easily 1st through 5th in his role in the region. Eccles, in terms of support, very easily 1st through 5th within his role in the region. Then you get to Link, things start getting a little bit murkier, and then you look at someone like Solkas, and again, this isn't me harping on him for a single set or a single game. If you par his performance over an extended period of time, things like his ADR on Raze, the genuine statistics that are highly indicative of high-level performance in the role that he plays within the team, he is simply not as good on his role as the other players on his team. If you rank him in a regional hierarchy, he is not on the same level as his teammates inside of his singular role silo. Sure. And so if you were going to make those types of changes, I think it becomes a sort of a walk down of, does Soulcast get switched out? Does Link get switched out? Does Eccles get switched out? And then I don't think you ever replace Cryptix or Scream unless you get something really magical. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, it's super tough. I think that it doesn't help as well that if they were going to be bringing in an Opera there, it is very clearly Soulcast's slot on the team. You're going to be bringing it in for that Raze Jet sort of niche within the composition. And so that doesn't help his situation at all.
I think when it comes to the agent role as well, because Fish123 looked incredible during the closed beta. They did have Anderzz on the team, which certainly helps, but you got to look at the fact of Soulcast being a player. He purely played Raze. That was the only agent that he played at that point. Link was over on Sage. The meta has changed. We've seen roles become a bit more versatile, that if you are, say, a Silver player, usually on across maps, when you get to split, you might need to be good on something like Raze. You might need to be good on something like Breach or Sage or even Sky now, as we saw in the Nerd Street Gamers Winter Championships. You can't just play one agent anymore unless the team builds around you. Soulcast, you could maybe do that before because he was such a good Raze. He is still such a good Raze. But you got Scream on your team. You want Scream to play what Scream wants to play, and you have to play around that. And that has been my problem from Team Liquid for a long time. It's why I would have been a bit more annoyed if Eccles was dropped, because yeah, sure, his stats in game aren't great. You can't really rely on, oh, I'm an IGL, so I'm allowed to underperform in the server in some cases to be an excuse. But at some point, he played Breach, he played Omen, he upped at the same time during a period. He has had to fulfill the role of 4 different people on Team Liquid. Because Link, they found a good spot with him on the Omen now. I think he's looking a lot sharper there now since his move away from Sage. But I still feel like Soulcast's Sova isn't quite to the same level of Anderzz, of course, for example, but a lot of the other Silver players. Did Team Liquid through First Strike look like a better team than we've seen through the Ignition stage?
They did, but not by as much as was promised. And I don't know how much is bled into the public discourse, but I know privately there was a lot of, okay, Team Liquid are back. Team Liquid are going to be very, very good going to First Strike. And what we saw of them was good, but not great. And I think the key thing to understand is that the one point they got a lot better on was the utilization of Scream. Because to give the short story of it, Fish123 in beta, the remarkable thing about Fish123 was that they made every round essentially a 5v4 because Anderzz would just make space for them, right? You had this extremely aggressive player in Anderzz, and then you had 4 players who were more conservative, playing more essentially fundamental CS, or literally in the sense of playing fundamental CS since they just come over from CS. And that worked great. And then Anderzz left, and it wasn't really like they tried to pick with Smoothie in one tournament. It wasn't really working the same way because nobody was creating that space for him anymore. And then Scream comes in. But the weird thing about Scream in Valorant is, while he was big time entry in CS, for the first few months in Valorant, he was not an entry player at all. Like, I think Link was getting him a first blood on that team, and Link was just playing Sage when Sage was ridiculous. He wasn't entry at all. Fast forward to First Strike. Okay, we very much know, like, he was the entry. The Scream was the entry. And we saw it, for example, if people want to go back, the best example, I think, was actually the qualifier game, where they just completely blew out Prodigy, now Giants, 13-5 on Ascent. That's by far their biggest win on stream, right? And it was all just because Scream just going in, Scream just creating a massive amount of space for them, which is fine, but it's better, but it's in how far do you really go from there? Because I feel like the other 4 players still have a very conservative mentality towards the game. And if you know just Scream's coming and they're just going to have to play around Scream and Scream can create all the space, it becomes easy to distract against that. So that's kind of the worrying thing for me. I feel like they were better in First Strike, but First Strike Liquid might have been the peak for that roster just because people didn't have a chance. People didn't have the tape. Like, they knew obviously Scream was good. They didn't have the tape for aggressive Scream at that point. And increasingly now they will, particularly with how the Champions format is going to go. So.
Sure. Seemed like a much more solidified Liquid, but sort of bringing it back to the ranking. Certainly this first portion of the Challenger Series, other stuff that's happening in Europe that people can't really go into at the moment. Anders, where are you putting Team Liquid? Not in a sense of where they would be with Yugi. We can touch on that a little bit if you want. But ultimately, this 5 players that we saw in First Strike for Team Liquid, we've got FPX and Heretics in the ladder already. I think it's... I mean, I'm not expecting a spicy take to say that they're better than Heretics, but if you were to put at a top 10, for example, whereabouts would you put Liquid in the rankings?
I think that conservatively right now, I think that something weird would have to happen for them to drop out of top 10. I think that they're not doing great in the top 10, but I think that for them to drop out of top 10, something very odd would have to be going on. To the point that we have FPX and Heretics on here right now. I don't think that you can really make an argument that they're better than either of those right now.
Right.
I don't think that you can get close to making the argument that they're better than either of them.
So for the ladder right now, as we're looking at it in with these 3 teams at least, is FPX still number 1, Heretics number 2, TL number 3? I guess, would it be different if they had Yugi in? Do you think that they would have had a bit more potential? Because I feel like it's nice to see them sort of locking their roles, for example. And I think that was the biggest problem with, the triple duelists, no controller stuff that Team Liquid did way back when, that we haven't seen a sense of consistency. So I did wonder if with potential roster changes and the ideas of changing out certain players for other ones, would that have improved Liquid's chances of breaking into top 5, for example?
I think that the better way to discuss it isn't if they had Yugi, it's a hypothetical of if they had someone slotted into their team, probably in Soulcast's spot, that was a higher performer on the role who could also flex into AW. Because that's ultimately what they would need and what I would expect them to bring onto the team with Yugi if they signed him. If they have that, I think that they then entered the realm of the teams that might move above Heretics when Heretics starts their 5th to 8th place slide. I still don't think they're better than FPX at any point, though.
Sure. I guess with Soulcast then, because his name is brought up a lot, and I think it's very easy to sort of point out that one map in that Heretics series. Across the Ignition era and all of that stuff, the last 6 months for Team Liquid Strong, is Soulcast the weak link on the team? And if so, why? Because I think you could point at many different players for Team Liquid that have not certainly hit the mark.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? I don't buy into the idea I think Soulcast is probably the weakest player on Liquid. I don't agree with Anderzz in terms of him being that far below everybody else. I think Cryptix is actually fairly overrated at this point because a lot of the way he plays Cypher was extremely good in beta, but it's kind of been found out. Because, I mean, actually, the funny thing is, if I think of Cryptix, the image that always comes to mind is Cryptix squatting right up on split B, just outside the tunnel with a shotgun, like a shotty. And that sort of, I'm surprised I got 2 kills. That sort of Cypher style isn't working so well anymore. I mean, the new agent makes that nearly impossible to sort of pull off, right? He had a lot of effectiveness early in beta. I don't think he's as good as people say going forward. Link, very good player mechanically. Obviously, did very well actually in First Strike with regards to having to play AWP on I think he was playing AWP on Brimstone on one of those maps, which is crazy.
You'd be good at that now.
Yeah. But so I think you can make a case for any of the 3 outside of really Eccles being the weakest. But the thing with Soulcast is he definitely doesn't play Raze as well as the other top Razes, and we have a lot of top Razes in Europe, right?
Yeah,
and that's the big problem. Like people like you saying, that's the big problem for me. And I don't think it's 100% that you'd have Soulcast will be immediately on the pecking order, but he is the one who I think has suffered the most in that regard because he hasn't showed particular mastery for his agent and his role beyond what literally everybody else is doing. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it anyway.
So I think more than anything, Team Liquid is very much at the mercy of other teams as we sort of talk about them. And I think one interesting one to highlight is the addition of Giants Gaming. They were announced officially on Saturday. The rumored lineup pretty much came to be with the 4 players from August. The one that wasn't part of this roster was Delezy, who was dropped. So you've got Happy in there. You've got Hoodie.
They agreed mutually, I should say.
Right, okay. Yeah. Which is an interesting one considering when you look at the new player they brought in. So that 4 was going to be Happy, Hoodie, Pipson, and Boo. And their 5th was ex-FPX player Meadow, who we spoke about previously. And this is a roster that did relatively well. at First Strike as Auglis or Prodigy, but I don't know if Meadow's the addition that makes this team great.
I actually do think, though, this is the perfect addition for them, and this actually elevates them from what's already going to be a pretty solid team to a top contender. Because if you watch, particularly if you watch, I mean, this is the thing, people kind of glossed over this, I don't really know why, but they put up really credible results at First Strike. Obviously, they lost they lost the first qualifier to Liquid. One of the maps was a 13-11, and then they got blown out on another one. They beat a lot of good teams, like a lot of solid tier 2 teams on the way in terms of qualifiers. I think they beat Leadmore DM, they beat Fearoff Stack, they beat Nolpenki at one point. They insofar as you can prove that you're good in a best of one qualifier, they kind of did so. And the G2 series was 13-11, 13-10. And the thing that you'll notice if you go to the G2 game, particularly on split, there was a big disparity. Like on offense, this team was really well organized, really well drilled. Hoodie was popping off. Happy was doing what he does. On defense, they struggled a little bit more, and it did seem like there was a degree to which G2 kind of ended up picking on Dleezy Cypher. So making that one change to a player who we know has the mechanical ability and sort of the game sense to hang with the biggest boys in Europe, right? We know that with Meadow. I think making that change actually could be huge for them. I think that could legitimately be the key to making a top contender. Questions with Pipson, but I think the questions are far overridden by the potential there.
I think the point with Pipson was that he is a player that even sort of tweeted back at me saying that he will play what the team needs. But he's been playing on Sova, and there is a thing, it's the complete opposite to North America. IGLs are hard to come by in Europe, and IGLs that frag out and can actually put some pretty good stats in a server to the likes of Angel, well, it's just Angel, really. You sort of look at players like Eccles, who we've highlighted, who is an IGL, doesn't do that well. I think Bonker is the best example of that, where very good IGL, has a good mind about him, but you put him on a role like Sova, where you would typically put a bit more of a fragger, like Anderzz, as we mentioned before, Sinatra over for Sentinels, those kind of like very aggressive players that can get a lot of stuff done. I don't know if Pipson is that. And when you have Meadow, who you would describe as passive, considering he was dropped from FPX for that kind of reason, Boo as well. Like, what do you think about this team, Anderzz? Like, what's the strength?
During First Strike, I think that they were already making a very strong case for themselves as a 5th through 8th place team in the region. Like, they very clearly deserve that spot.
Yes.
I think that bringing in Meadow over Dleezy is a objective upgrade. I think that you could almost not make an argument that is an upgrade in every single way. Based off of that logic, they were a 5th through 8th place team. They are flat out going to be better, and other teams around them are more widely than not making bad changes or no changes, at least in that 5th through 8th bracket. And so, for me at least, I have to be largely in Strong's camp, where I think that this team is going to be very, very scary. I think that, to your concerns where it comes to mechanics, when you get to the level that they're at, this top 8, top 5 pool, I think that the gap in mechanics is not as dramatic as it otherwise would be. And I think the fact that, to your point, they do have a mind in Pipson and a team that can very effectively set up very well orchestrated executes and set plays is more valuable than the incremental gap in mechanics. I think the fact that they can come in with an extremely strong playbook will be stronger for them than having incrementally better mechanics will be in the long run.
For sure. That makes a lot of sense. In regards to other members of their roster, Hoodie on the Jet Opping had some insane stats during First Strike. I think he was one of the most impactful Jet Oppers out there. And Happy, even more surprisingly, played for, like, started from CS way back when on a more subtle role, playing Sage. Wasn't as aggressive before, but on the Raze, I think that duo could do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to getting entries, getting kills, finding openings. But now we sort of get to the sort of end of, like, rating them. You've sort of said that they're 5 to 8th. I think it's fair to say that they're looking to be better than Liquid because their form, the way that they seem to play the game, perhaps, and they do feel like they're going into VCT with a lot of momentum with their roster. Where are we rating them when it comes to the other 3 teams, FPX, Heretics, and Liquid? Because I think that, myself personally, I'd put them over TL because Giants seem to have a lot more going for them currently, but I don't know about Heretics.
I think you can go either way with it, honestly. I think that this is like the prime situation where Heretics are your gatekeepers of being a tier 1 team in Europe now. If Giants can rise to the challenge of beating Heretics, that establishes them as an undisputable top tier 1 team. If they can't, which it wouldn't surprise me either way. I think that it's genuinely a coin flip of whether or not they can surpass them. It'll be interesting to see. I think you could literally put them one slot above Heretics, one slot below Heretics, and I wouldn't disagree with either strongly.
Would you both agree to put them over Liquid?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so if we slam them there, I guess then, like for you, Strong, what is the thing that's going to make Giants Gaming click? What is the player or the playstyle or the map, the agents, whatever? What's going to be the thing that makes them stand out to be potentially a top team within Europe?
I mean, the big thing essentially is strengthening their CT sides, because that was the thing that let them down big time in First Strike. And essentially, how Medu's going to play, I think, particularly with Boo. Like, I feel like you underrate Boo a little bit actually, because you've got to remember he was on the original Nopenki, the one that was in content. You could say obviously it was
the Lithuanian stack.
The Lithuanian stack, but which was, you could make a case for they were top 6, top 7 in Europe at points, right? And he was probably the second best player on that stack. He's by no like he's playing support roles now. He's playing like stuff like the Viper. He's not a slouch. But I feel like if Meadow and Boo can perform well and can perform well under Pipson's instruction, then everything else will follow, right? Happy and Hoodie, we know they're good enough. Like Hoodie's good enough to entry. Happy's good. Happy's probably the best lurker in Europe, I'd say. If you can be quite happy with that side of the team, the question more so is the CT side, which comes a lot down to these anchor players, these support players. So if those two can click with Pipson, we can get results out of those two, then sky's the limit. If Meadow and Pipson don't work out so well together, then you might struggle a bit more. But I think that's the big thing. You want to watch their CT sides. You want to watch how they perform now, because that was the big thing for like the last couple of months.
Okay, I think with Pipson as well, I think he's a really interesting player to come back to, because when you look back in time at the worst players roster, nobody even really seemed to notice or care about them. But when you actually look at the players, you've got Dimasic, who moved to FPX, Chihuahua, who moved to Ninjas in Pajamas. Very good players in the CIS region, mechanically sound and just very aggressive. Like when it comes to sort of rating Pipson as an IGL or a player, what are his standout attributes? Because I don't know if it's just like a sort of negative connotation I have attached to him, because like I could not be paying attention maybe, or somebody said something like a coach and it sort of stuck in my ear and my mind about what I perceive as how good Pipson is. But he always felt a bit like the bonker IGL kind of thing, where he was good at doing that role and fulfilling that role within a team, but maybe not that good when it came to winning duels, for example. I don't know if you guys agree or not.
One very crucial thing to sort of point out is, okay, statistically in the last couple of months, he's been poor in terms of just the fragging and stuff like that, right? That is true. But during beta and during early ignition, obviously there's a lot of caveats to that with regards to the standard of competition, etc., etc. But the thing that people notice about worst players, and the reason that I think Pips and Chua both got invited to G2 Invitational that kicked off ignition, if I'm remembering correctly, but it was because they were putting on a two-man show in those early tournaments like E-Pulse. Pipson was doing the Angel thing where he was taking Brimstone, getting 25 kills.
Yes.
So
yes, you're right.
It's kind of hard to see what's happened in the last couple of months that brought it down that much, but I don't think it's the case where I don't look at Pipson and think, okay, this guy just can't frag. I'm not quite sure what's happened, like with regards to how his roles developed, with regards to how the team's developed, with regards to what's developed around him. Sure. I don't think it's indisputably the case that he just can't win duels. We'll sort of see. I guess we'll see over time. Like he did have some of the worst like ACS and combat stats in the entire region going into first strike. That is true, but that was recent. That hasn't been in the entire story of his career.
Like there's minor concern when it comes to, they're bringing in a new player. It's a 4-player stack of a pre-existing team, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, I genuinely think that they're bringing in the role that's easiest to integrate in a new roster. The way that most teams are playing the game right now, if you have to switch out a 5th player, you want it to be your Sentinel, period. If your preference is to switch out anyone that isn't that role, then you have a really weird team dynamic going on. I don't know what's happening. So I think that I have actually far less concerns about bringing in meta than a lot of people might on the surface. And so I think it's more a question of, does bringing in a more consistent, sort of stronger firepower Sentinel actually shore up their CT sides or not? Because we don't know for sure whether or not it's a more systemic issue with the way that they're playing that side of the map. I mean, I haven't pored over their VODs to the extent that I would have to make a strong judgment call on that. But that's what I would honestly be looking at most critically is will solely replacing your Sentinel player for someone that is better in that role going to be enough to fix your defensive sides, or will there be additional steps required, and will you take those additional steps?
Yeah, and
I actually do think the talent level pound for pound on Giants is higher than Liquid right now, which might be controversial, but that's how I see it. So
yeah.
that's why I have faith in them.
Yeah, I think Scream is, if you were to line up all 10 players and rate them from best to worst, Scream is the top, but then it's Happy and Hoodie following right behind him, and I think 2 instead of 1 is going to be a stronger thing going for Giants. But this is 4 teams currently. It has been, 2 weeks since the first episode, but I know for a fact that, some of these teams are locked in. We know NiP, for example, Vitality are playing in a tournament, but just not as Vitality at this point. We know that Summon are staying together. We just don't know what banner they're going to be under for the start of VCT, if they're going to be under one. I feel like these episodes will start to come out thick and fast, so be sure to tune in for them, and we'll see you in the future. Don't go anywhere. I was going to say don't go anywhere. Don't just sit around for 2 weeks, for Christ's sake. We'll see you in the future. Bye.